Hello, my name is Katherine Stewart, and I'm an associate professor at the Department of Soil Science at the University of Saskatchewan. And I'd like to thank Guillaume for the opportunity to be here today and present as part of the panel, even though I wasn't able to make it physically to Whitehorse. Today, what I'd like to talk about are approaches for restoring northern mine sites with native plants. As many of you are aware, there are many challenges with conducting restoration in a boreal forest environment. Some of the challenges include long time frames for natural recolonization, which may require active restoration approaches to be used. Short growing seasons with relatively harsh climates. Moisture limitation during the growing season is one of those key issues that we often face. Remote locations, which might mean that approaches that require heavy equipment or require us to bring a lot of restoration materials to site don't work well in some of these scenarios. And a limited commercially available seed source or revegetation materials that can be used. So we really have a limited seed source for a lot of boreal species. We have some limited knowledge even on how to propagate some of these species, and relatively few native plant greenhouses in Canada that can grow plants up. And this really is a challenge. So when we think further specifically about mine sites, when we have development occurring at a mine without a lot of forethought for reserving overburden and topsoil resources and even plant resources prior to disturbance, we can find ourselves in a scenario where we have very limited resources to use when we start on a restoration project. Even in scenarios where we may have sufficient overburden, a lot of that overburden tends to be very low in organic matter, which really limits the nutrient cycling processes that are so critical for sustaining our plant communities. In addition to that, a lot of the substrates that we have are low in pH, so they're quite acidic, and this can exacerbate issues with heavy metals that might become more bioavailable if we have heavy metals or elevated heavy metals in those substrates. In addition, we often have organic contaminants in those substrates as well, things like hydrocarbons. So we often find ourselves in scenarios where we're either concurrently doing remediation and restoration, or we must remediate first before we can actually restore. Another thing that is relevant to working on mine sites is the scale of disturbance. So if we have a relatively large mine footprint, even if we have intact boreal forest surrounding that mine site, the distance for seed sources may be quite great. And especially if we're working on a limited timeline for recovery, this may really necessitate active restoration on our mine site. So today I want to talk about 4 key concepts. These are all based in restoration ecology theory, and they also come from my own experience in doing restoration projects all over northern Canada. And so the first one is to learn from natural recovery to disturbance. So really taking time to examine how plant communities are recolonizing post-disturbance. This includes both natural disturbances like fires as well as human-induced disturbances. This can give us critical information about what types of species we should be aiming at, as well as what types of environments do we need to be establishing to support those species. And this really links to the second concept, which is the idea of creating niche for native species. So what are the conditions that will actually support our native plant to germinate and grow? This is what we term its niche. And if we get those plants established, how can we promote further plant establishment through facilitation? The third concept is ensuring that we have native plant diversity. It is really critical, especially in remote northern locations, that we're not introducing non-native or invasive plants. And fourth, the idea of promoting ecosystem functions is really critical for long-term restoration success. If we don't get these key nutrient cycling processes in place, then often our restoration efforts are not very successful over the long term. And so what I'm going to do now is talk about each of these concepts within the context of some different ongoing projects that we have. So the first project I'm going to talk about is at Wheeler River in northern Saskatchewan. This is a proposed in situ recovery uranium mine. And with my graduate student, Olivia Urich, this summer we went out and we looked at a whole chronosequence, a fire chronosequence, so a natural disturbance chronosequence, to really understand how were these communities starting to assemble. And so this is a very dry pine dominated ecosystem. And what we found was that following fire, within the first months to 2 to 3 years, bryophytes or mosses were really critical in early establishment, in stabilizing soils. We also saw that the shrub Vaccinium myrtleides, or blueberry, also appeared very soon after fire, as well as our tree, jack pine, or Pinus banksiana. Interestingly, both the vaccinium and the pinus we found persisted later into successional stages as well. So we were finding it in stands that were 30 to 50 to even 100 years old. So they're very critical species in this particular ecosystem. So based on this information, we've established a series of trials looking at moss amendments, as shredded moss that's added, as moss mats that are added. We've incorporated wildfire charcoal because we saw this as such a key soil element in the natural regeneration in these forests. So adding it just to the top 5 centimeters. And after putting these amendments in, next year we'll go back and plant jack pine and blueberry in association with these amendments to see if we can better understand how the moss and charcoal might be helping to facilitate the establishment and growth of some of these key vascular plants. So as I mentioned, creating niche is really important. And I'm going to talk very briefly about this project because Ben Budsey, who's another graduate student of mine, is here today, and we'll talk at much more length about this project, which is based at Minto Mine. And so if you see the diagram in the left-hand corner, you'll see that when we talk about this idea of niche, we can have a realized niche, which is where we actually find the species. We can have a fundamental niche, which is where we could expect that species to survive in terms of its range of, in this case, temperature and precipitation. And then we also have a tolerance niche. So how far can we push those ranges of temperature and moisture, and the species can still survive? And so in this project, one of the things that we wanted to do was try to promote some niches that we think would help vegetation come in. And so in the photo there, you can see the orange snow fence in the back. This is an abiotic vertical structure, and we're hoping that traps moisture and creates some niche near the fence. In the foreground, there's an alder hedgerow. And again, this has the capacity to change some of those soil conditions, create niche for other species to come in. And with the alder, because it's a nitrogen fixer, we may also expect elevated nitrogen levels in the soil there. So this next project I want to talk about is Rihanna Moore's graduate work, and she also has lived and worked in the Yukon for a while, so some of you may know her. And Rihanna's work, she's really looking at interactions between different species and between moss amendments and seeing if there are different combinations of boreal species that have some positive facilitatory effects on growth. And so she's got a bryophyte soil amendment, a bit of a different bryophyte than Olivia's working with. So this is a fire moss. And then she's co-planting different combinations of common boreal plants, and then looking at the interactions of those things to see if they influence vascular plant establishment and growth. So her work is based at the Detour mine in Northern Ontario, and she's working primarily on overburden. And you can see that she's got a number of different species that she's incorporating in this co-planting. So things like white spruce, she's got a willow, fireweed. We're even working with a lichen, Cladonia rangiferina, as well as Canada blue joint or Calmagrosis, which is a grass. And so her work is really focused around facilitation. Can these different combinations help to facilitate the establishment of the plants? So the third concept that I wanted to touch on is around ensuring that we have native diversity. And this is some work from the Coffee Creek site that we did way back in 2016. This is on a drilling pad. And in this work, what we did is we went and harvested intact plant soil islands. So this is subalpine plugs, we call them, or islands. And we have soil resources underneath, and then we have entire communities that we've harvested and moved onto the drilling pad. And this is a bit of an applied nucleation approach where we try to create a little island that can then expand from that location. And so this is in 2022, and you can see the fireweeds really coming in, the grass has really taken off, and on this small scale disturbance, some might say, is it even worth doing all that work to do that transplanting? Well, we do know that where we see those more extensive tufts of grass, those are some of our transplanted subalpine plugs. And what's interesting is when we looked more closely at those, we really see that there is a diversity of plants that has been maintained over time. So we've got dwarf birch, we've got bunchberry, we've got cranberry, and we've got a whole community of mosses, polytrichums, pleurozium mosses, reindeer lichens that are still in place associated with some of those turfs. So we're helping to maintain that whole community through this approach. And finally, the last thing I wanted to touch on is the importance of promoting the recovery of ecosystem functions. So in these pictures here, we're sampling gas flux from vegetation that's recovering naturally on drilling waste at the Meliadine mine site outside of Rankit Inlet. So this is a little bit further north. And the reason we're doing this is we're trying to understand the role that some of these early communities might be playing in bringing carbon and nitrogen back into our soil systems. So through photosynthesis and nitrogen fixation, these mosses, or in these case, these biological soil crusts, can play a huge role in releasing those metabolites into a soil system that then can be taken up by soil microbes, that improves our nutrient cycling processes, and at the end of the day, makes those nutrients available to plants. And so this is some of the theoretical work that's really critical that we continue to develop so that it can inform restoration practice. And so I'd like to thank everyone for your attention. And I have left my email address there. if anyone wants to get a hold of me. Thank you very much.